isn't really about the distance. Not in the way people think. It's not about 50 miles, 100 miles, or crossing some finish line. It's about what happens when everything in you starts asking you to stop and you decide not to. At some point out there, things will go wrong. Your legs will tighten. Your stomach will turn. The weather won't cooperate. Your pace will fall apart. The race you imagine will disappear. That moment isn't a failure of your plan. It is the race. The mental toughness is not a hype. It's not yelling at yourself or pretending pain doesn't exist. It's quieter than that. It's the decision over and over again to keep moving forward when forward feels meaningless. It's being honest. This hurts. This is hard. And continuing anyway. You don't need to feel strong to be strong. That's the trick. Strength in ultra running shows up when you feel weak and you still take the next step, and then another, and then another. There will be long stretches where nothing feels good. No rhythm, no flow, no confidence, just effort. That's where most people start negotiating with themselves. Maybe today's not my day. Maybe I'll try again another time. But mental toughness is recognizing that those thoughts are just noise, not commands. You don't have to win the whole race in one moment. You just have to win this moment. Get to the next aid station. Get to the next tree. Get to the next mile marker. Break the impossible into pieces small enough that your mind can handle them. And remember this, you've already done hard things than you think. Every early morning, every long run, every time you didn't feel like training, but did anyways. You've been building this, not just your body, but your ability to endure discomfort without panic. Out there, patience becomes power. Discipline becomes freedom. And forward, no matter how slow, becomes victory. So when it gets dark, when it gets quiet, when it gets hard, in a way you didn't expect, don't look for motivation. Look for commitment. Motivation fades. Commitment stays. Keep moving. Stay present. Trust that you can handle more than your mind is telling you because you can. And that's what makes you an ultra runner. Welcome in to Running Miles with Heart Disease CHD. I'm your host and coach, Josh. Today we're going to be talking about mental toughness, and we're going to talk about ways to improve your mental toughness. What is mental toughness? And so that's basically what we're going to talk about today. So what is mental toughness? Well, mental toughness is basically, fighting through the pain or overcoming what your mind is telling you what not to do. So basically, if you're feeling tired, you don't feel like going for that training run today because you just don't feel like it. Not that you're injured or something like that. Just you're tired and you'd rather be doing something else. It's kind of fighting that mindset or that thought and overcoming it. And it's something you can do for the mental toughness is overcoming the bad thoughts or the negative thoughts, and knowing that you can just push that away and start thinking a different thought. And one of the ways you can always train for mental toughness is, you can always have a set target in mind of in your training and go like an extra mile, and that can always help your mental toughness. Another way is you can break up the miles. Instead of looking at your watch and looking, you got 30 more miles to go and you're already feeling really tired, not focusing on the 30 miles or the 40 miles that you still have to go, but you can start thinking about just an aid station just a little bit further, or think about the food that you're going to eat when you get to the next aid station. Might help your mental toughness and giving you hope, I guess, for the next aid station, and something to be excited about when you get to the next aid station. Knowing your why, you want to know your why can help your mental toughness, because you thinking about the money you're raising, or the personal challenge that you have, or if you're going for a PR, okay, yeah, I need to keep going. I know things are not going well, but keep going. And and hopefully if you remember your why, that can help the pain go away. But each mile that you're going, it's completely different, and it's so crazy that you get a second win, a third win, a fourth win sometimes when you're running that far, for sure. Practicing discomfort when you're about to race, don't think it's gonna be all sunshine and rainbows. Sometimes during your running and your training, not everything's going to be perfect. So just understanding that and knowing can help your mental toughness. Visualize the race a little bit and know that not everything's going to go as planned. Obviously, if you signed up for a race, you believe in yourself that you can run the ultra. Obviously, there's two different mindsets, right? There's I can't do it, or there's I can do it, right? And either way, both statements are correct, right? If you believe you can't do something, you're correct. You're not going to do it. If you believe you can do something, you're correct. You can do it. So, just staying positive out there and doing your best and forgetting the rest. But let's listen to AI, and we'll see. They're just going to pull from a bunch of websites here, and we'll see if we can get some new strategies for mental toughness, and hopefully that can help you guys out completing the race and staying, keep moving forward. So I also wanted to thank you guys for listening. I know there's a lot out there. Audiobooks, there's lots of podcasters out there. I mean, it's just so crazy. And if you're gonna listen to the whole episode, definitely appreciate it. They're pretty long, I know. So if you are here listening today, I appreciate it. And remember, you can always follow, and you can always reach out, and I'll be happy to get you a plan, and then help you with whatever race you want, or help you pick out a race, whatever you need. Yeah, just thanks for tuning in, and definitely honored to have you with me, because there's definitely so much you can educate yourself with out there, whether it's podcasts or an audiobook, or if you're using your time to listen to music. So there's definitely a lot to listen to, a lot to focus on. So hopefully this is bringing some value to your life, and hopefully it's helping you finish some races. But yeah, thanks for being here, and definitely wanted to thank you for listening and tuning in. All right, let me go ahead and get AI for you.
You are like 50 miles into a foot race.
Right.
It's 2 o'clock in the morning. You are entirely alone in the woods, and your headlamp is cutting this tiny, erratic cone of light through the freezing fog.
Just a brutal environment.
Completely brutal. Your legs feel like lead, your stomach is doing somersaults, and every single alarm bell in your brain is just screaming at you to stop.
Yeah.
Just sit down. Just quit.
Because it is the ultimate evolutionary override. I mean, in that specific moment, your body is desperately trying to save your life.
Right.
But you are trying to cross an arbitrary finish line. It's this fundamental biological conflict of interest between survival and ambition. And your brain, frankly, doesn't care about your ambition.
And that biological conflict is exactly why we pulled this specific stack of research together for you today. Because there's this saying in the ultra endurance community that you run the first 50 miles with your body, but you run the second 50 miles entirely with your heart and your mind.
Excellent.
So our mission today is to dive into the ultimate invisible performance enhancer, which is mental toughness. I want to figure out if we can actually, hack that biological failure.
Which is a fascinating concept.
It really is. So we're pulling from cutting edge sports psychology, physiological models, and some truly harrowing firsthand accounts to understand what mental toughness actually is, how it's built, and how it can literally make or break an athlete.
Yeah.
Okay, let's unpack this, because I think the average person assumes mental toughness is a genetic lottery. Like you're either born with this crazy grit or you aren't, like having blue eyes.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we are going to explore some very specific lists today. We're going to break down the 10 best ways to build mental toughness, the 10 ways you might be actively destroying it, and the surprising dangers of having too much mental toughness. But to your point about genetics, treating mental toughness as an innate trait is one of the biggest, most damaging misconceptions out there.
So it's not just stubbornness.
No, not at all. It's not just colloquial grit. When we look at the clinical research, mental toughness is a multidimensional construct. It encompasses resilience, self-efficacy, emotional intelligence, and cognitive flexibility.
That sounds like a lot to juggle while you're running.
It is. But in the specific context of endurance sports, we define it as the psychological architecture that allows an athlete to maintain a high fraction of their aerobic capacity while under extreme physical and emotional strain. It is a highly trainable skill set.
I am so fascinated by the idea that you can be too tough for your own good, which we'll get into. But before we get into the psychology, I have to push back a little on this idea of the mind controlling the fatigue.
Sure, go ahead.
Because to me, and I think to anyone who has ever run a hard mile, fatigue feels like a purely physical, mechanical failure.
Right, it feels completely biological.
Yeah, like think about a modern sports car.
Yeah.
If you are driving a car and it runs completely out of gas or the engine block cracks, the car stops. It doesn't matter how mentally tough the driver is, the machinery has failed.
That makes intuitive sense.
So isn't my mid-race fatigue just my muscles running out of glycogen fuel or drowning in lactic acid?
Well, that is exactly what mainstream science believed for decades. It was called the peripheral fatigue model.
Peripheral meaning like the limbs.
Exactly. The idea was that the muscles fail locally at the periphery of the body because they are out of fuel or choked by metabolites. But modern sports science has largely debunked that.
Really? Debunked it entirely?
Or at least heavily recontextualized it. To understand what is actually happening in the woods at 2 a.m, we have to look at the central governor model.
Okay.
This was popularized by the renowned researcher Dr. Tim Noakes, who was building on concepts from a physiologist named A.V. Hill all the way back in the 1920s.
The central governor model. So, if I'm staying with my car analogy, is the brain acting less like the fuel tank and more like the car's onboard computer, like a rev limiter?
That is a perfect analogy. If a sports car's engine gets too hot, the computer throttles the fuel injection to prevent the engine block from literally melting.
Right, it forces the car to slow down.
Exactly. The car has the mechanical capability to go faster, but the software actively cuts the power to save the hardware. Your brain is the rev limiter.
Wow.
The brain's primary job is not to help you win a silver belt buckle. Its primary job is to maintain homeostasis and keep you alive. It constantly monitors this vast array of telemetry, your heart rate, core temperature, blood glucose levels, oxygenation, and even the ambient temperature outside.
So it's constantly running calculations based on the environment.
Yes. And if the brain perceives that your current level of exertion is a threat to your physical integrity, say you are running too fast in high heat, it actively intervenes.
It just shuts you down.
It doesn't ask your permission. It limits the neural recruitment of muscle fibers to prevent catastrophic biological damage.
Wait. So when my quads are burning on a steep hill or they feel impossibly heavy, that's not just the muscle tissue crying out in localized pain.
Not exactly. The burn and that profound sensation of heavy fatigue are actually subjective sensations that the brain actively generates.
The brain is making it up.
It's an illusion with a purpose. The brain anticipates the environment, it knows how hot it is, it calculates the distance remaining based on your visual input, and it decides on a safe maximum pace. To enforce that safe pace, it reduces the neural motor signals traveling down your spinal cord to your leg muscles.
It literally turns down the dial.
It turns down the dial on muscle fiber recruitment. The fatigue you feel is a calculated sensation, an emotional trick created by the brain to force a behavioral change. It makes you slow down before you actually run out of gas.
That is wild. So it's essentially a hostage negotiation between my conscious ambition and my subconscious survival instinct that completely recontextualizes the entire experience of exercise.
It really does.
But, that rev limiter analogy perfectly explains a phenomenon I've always wondered about, the finish line sprint.
Yes. The classic finish line sprint is the ultimate observable proof of the central governor model in action.
Right. Because you see it in every marathon. A runner is at mile 24. They have hit the wall. They are shuffling. Their form is falling apart. They look completely exhausted, like they physically couldn't possibly run a single second faster.
They look totally tapped out.
But then they turn the final corner. They see the finish line 400 meters away. The crowds are cheering, and suddenly they are sprinting at a sub 6 minute mile pace. If the car was truly mechanically out of gas, that sprint would be physiologically impossible.
Precisely. If fatigue were purely peripheral, if the muscles were truly tapped out of glycogen and functionally dead, that runner would be mechanically unable to speed up no matter how much they wanted to.
Right.
But what actually happens is that the brain's visual cortex registers the finish line. It calculates the remaining distance, and the central governor realizes, okay, we are 400 meters away. There is no longer any risk of catastrophic physiological failure before we stop.
So it drops the restriction.
The overprotective software finally lets go of the hardware. The central governor opens up the biological pathways, suddenly recruiting all those muscle fibers it was hoarding in reserve, and the athlete sprints. It proves unequivocally that the limits of human endurance are flexible, and we almost always have physical reserves that the brain is actively withholding from us.
That is just wild to think about. We are essentially running with the parking brake partially engaged. But if the subconscious brain is holding us back, how does an athlete consciously override that software? Is it just raw willpower?
That brings us to another critical framework in the sources, the psychobiological model, which was championed by a researcher named Samuel Marcora.
How does that differ from the central governor?
Well, while Noakes' central governor model focuses on subconscious neural regulation, Marcora's model looks at the conscious experience of fatigue. He proposes that fatigue is ultimately a conscious decision.
A decision.
Yeah, it is an ongoing real-time cost-benefit analysis where you are constantly weighing your perceived effort against your motivation.
So perceived exertion isn't just a physical measurement, it's a psychological one. As long as the motivation to continue outweighs the perception of how hard the work feels, you keep running.
Exactly. When the perceived effort finally exceeds your motivation, you make the conscious choice to quit. And this introduces a massive vulnerability, which is ego depletion.
Tell me about ego depletion.
The prefrontal cortex, which handles willpower and self-regulation, is an absolute energy hog, suppressing the urge to stop, forcing yourself to choke down a gel when you feel nauseous, constantly negotiating with the panol. All of that cognitive processing drains your brain's blood glucose just as rapidly as running drains your leg's glycogen.
So when people say they are mentally exhausted after a hard day of work, that's not just a metaphor. It has a direct detrimental impact on their physical output.
It absolutely does. The literature shows that mental fatigue significantly spikes your rate of perceived exertion, or RPE. If you start a race mentally fatigued from a stressful week at work or poor sleep, the exact same physical pace will feel exponentially harder than it would if you were mentally fresh.
even if your muscles are fully rested.
Exactly. The physical output is the same, but the brain's interpretation of the effort is magnified.
Which naturally brings us to the concept of pain itself. Because in these ultra endurance events, pain isn't just a possibility, it is the constant, guaranteed companion.
Unavoidable.
And the sources we looked at highlighted some truly incredible historical data on pain perception, specifically looking back at battlefield triage in World War I.
Yes, this is a staggering data point for understanding the psychology of pain. Researchers looking at historical medical records found that roughly 50% of soldiers who sustained horrendous traumatic wounds on the battlefield, we're talking lost limbs, massive shrapnel injuries, they didn't require morphine.
Wait, 50% with massive physical trauma. How does the brain even process that?
It demonstrates that pain is not a simple objective input like a microphone picking up sound.
Right.
It is an assessment made by the brain based on context.
The context of the injury.
Right. In the context of World War I battlefield, sustaining a severe wound often meant one specific thing to a soldier: a ticket home. It meant they were removed from the immediate mortal terror of the trenches.
Oh, wow.
Because the brain subconsciously evaluated the injury as a positive life-saving event, an escape from the war. It completely inhibited the nociceptive signals. The injury was there, the structural tissue damage was undeniably real, but the conscious, agonizing experience of pain was heavily muted.
And the sports psychology sources tied this directly to modern athletes with the famous ice water study, right?
Yes, exactly.
Researchers took a group of elite athletes and a control group of regular non-athletes and had them submerge their hands in buckets of freezing ice water to see who could hold them in longer.
And unsurprisingly, the elite athletes held their hands in the freezing water significantly longer. But the crucial finding here wasn't that the athletes had genetically thicker skin or deadened nerve endings in their hands.
Right, their hands were getting just as cold.
The physiological stress was identical. The difference was that their rigorous physical training had conditioned their psychological relationship to pain. They didn't feel less pain, they just had a much higher tolerance for it because they had learned not to attach panic or catastrophic meaning to the sensation.
They altered the internal narrative around the sensation.
Precisely. And this raises a profound point about emotion and biochemistry. The research shows that elite ultrarunners often report actively enjoying the pain.
Enjoying it. That sounds crazy.
It sounds paradoxical, but they don't just tolerate the suffering, they reframe it as a cathartic, necessary part of their personal growth. They view the pain as the very tool they are using to sculpt their resilience.
I see.
Conversely, when an athlete experiences negative emotions like fear, anxiety, or the despair of feeling like they are losing, their perception of pain chemically skyrockets.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting to me. We were talking about these extraordinary athletes who can endure tremendous pain, who override their central governor, who possess this massive reservoir of willpower. It sounds like a superpower. But is there a dark side to this? Like, can you actually have too much mental toughness?
The surprising and often tragic answer is yes, absolutely. When psychologists run personality profiles on ultra-endurance athletes, they find a very specific cluster of traits.
What kind of traits?
Well, these athletes score exceptionally high in a trait called conscientiousness, which means they are highly industrious, goal-oriented, and disciplined. But crucially, they also score unusually low in a trait called harm avoidance.
Meaning they don't naturally possess the instinct to shy away from things that might physically damage them.
Right. Now, while a low harm avoidance trait is fantastic for getting you across the finish line of a brutal 100-mile race, it carries severe pathological risks. In the literature, we have to draw a hard line between what psychologists define as harmonious passion and obsessive passion.
Break the difference down for me.
Harmonious passion is an additive state. The sport enhances your life. You love the training process, you love the community, you love the fitness, but your identity isn't solely defined by your race results.
So if you fail, you're still you.
Exactly. If you have a bad race and drop out, you are disappointed, but you go back to your family and your job and you move on. Obsessive passion, on the other hand, is a state where your entire self-worth and identity are tied exclusively to the outcome of the race. The sport ceases to be a hobby and becomes a psychological compulsion.
And the data on this within the ultra community is slightly terrifying. The sources noted that roughly 20% of ultra runners screen positive for clinical exercise addiction.
That's a huge number.
But the statistic that really stopped me in my tracks was this. When surveyed, an astonishing 74.1% of ultra runners admitted that they would not stop running ultramarathons, even if they received definitive medical proof that it was actively destroying their long-term health.
Nearly 3/4 of them would consciously choose the sport over their own long-term physical well-being. That is the very definition of obsessive passion overriding biological common sense. And this hyper-tough mindset leads to one of the most dangerous phenomenons in endurance sports, which is the masking of real structural injury.
Yes, the sources provided two incredibly visceral firsthand stories about this exact trap. First, there was Keely Henninger at the Western States 100.
Right.
For context, Western States is essentially the Super Bowl of trail running. It's brutally hot. It goes through these massive canyons in California. Keely sprains her ankle terribly at mile 12.
Mile 12.
Mile 12 of a 100-mile race. Most people would literally call an ambulance. But she is so profoundly mentally tough, she just pushes through it. She manages to keep running for dozens of miles, subconsciously altering her biomechanics and adjusting her stride to favor the ankle until she inevitably sprains it again later in the race and the joint becomes catastrophically unstable.
It just gives it.
Yeah. She is forced to walk, her whole kinetic chain is destroyed, and eventually she is gutted, crying on the side of the trail, realizing her race is over, and she has likely done severe tissue damage.
And then there is the accompanying story of Alexa, who was 40 miles into a 100-miler in the remote, muddy coastal mountains of Oregon. She's running in the pitch dark, feeling strong, and suddenly she feels a sharp, audible pop in her knee.
Ugh. An audible pop is never good.
Never. She falls to the ground, she tries to stand up, and she literally cannot bear weight on the leg. Because of how remote she is, she has to limp 5 miles through the freezing, muddy forest just to get to the next aid station to drop out.
And in both of these stories, the heartbreak they describe isn't just the physical pain of the torn ligaments. It's the profound psychological devastation of the DNF that did not finish. But it perfectly highlights the danger you just mentioned. Because these athletes are so intensely mentally tough, they completely blur the line between discomfort and injury.
And making that distinction is arguably the most vital mental skill for anyone doing endurance sports. Discomfort is the burning lungs, the heavy quads, the general systemic fatigue. That is what mental toughness is designed to push through. That is the central governor being overprotective.
But injury pain is different.
Very different. Injury pain is sharp, localized, and structural. It is a tearing ligament, a stress fracture, a ruptured tendon. If you have too much mental toughness, or if your ego is too wrapped up in avoiding a DNF, you will use your mental skills to override the pain of structural damage.
Which is just dangerous.
You sacrifice your long-term physical wellness for a short-term ego boost. You push past the point of bravery and cross directly into the territory of self-destruction.
Going back to our car analogy, it's the central governor saying, hey, the engine block is literally cracking in half, and the driver just turns up the radio so they don't have to hear the clanking.
A perfect extension of the analogy. Mental toughness absolutely must be paired with self-awareness and emotional maturity. Otherwise, it is just a weapon you are indiscriminately pointing at yourself.
Okay, so we've defined what this phenomenon is. We understand the science of the brain acting as a rev limiter, and we know the pathological dangers of taking it too far. So how do we actually build the right foundation? How can an everyday runner, or really anyone facing a massive, grueling challenge, improve their mental toughness in a healthy way?
It begins by recognizing that this is absolutely a trainable skill. Just as you do threshold intervals on a track to build your cardiovascular engine, you have to do specific, targeted exercises to build your cognitive resilience. The sports psychology frameworks we analyzed summarize the foundation of mental toughness as the 5 C's.
Let's break down the 5 C's.
They are commitment, courage, concentration, control, and confidence. Commitment is your deep-seated dedication to the goal, your why. Courage is your willingness to face inevitable pain without retreating. Concentration is your cognitive ability to maintain focus on the immediate task when your body is exhausted. Control is how effectively you manage your emotional and physiological responses to sudden adversity. And confidence is your underlying evidence-based belief in your own capability.
And the crucial point the sources make is that you don't just magically manifest these 5 traits on the morning of a big race.
Absolutely not. And that is the biggest, most common mistake amateur athletes make. You would never attempt to run 20 miles on race day if the farthest you would ever run in training was 5 miles. Yet, athletes constantly try to introduce a brand new mental skill like a mantra or a deep breathing technique standing on the starting line, having never once practiced it.
It's bound to fail.
It requires daily, dedicated practice. Elite coaches outline programs like a 30-day mindset builder, which requires just 5 minutes a day of focused mental training, like visualization or breath work, integrated directly into your physical routine.
But the training isn't just sitting in a quiet, comfortable room meditating, right? There is a highly physical component to building this mental foundation. You have to practice being miserable.
Yes, to build true transferable mental durability, you have to pair the mental exercises with targeted physical stress. Elite coaches use a programming technique called stress clusters or mini blocks.
What does that look like?
Well, in ultra running, this often looks like running back-to-back long runs on the weekend. You run 20 hard miles on Saturday. Then you wake up on Sunday, your legs are heavy, your glycogen stores are heavily depleted, your mind is tired, you don't want to get out of bed, and you go run another 15 miles.
You are intentionally putting yourself in the pain cave.
You're intentionally exposing the brain to high levels of discomfort in a controlled, non-race environment. You are actively teaching the central governor, look, I know we're heavily fatigued, I know the fuel is low, but we are not going to die.
You're recalibrating it.
Exactly. You're safely stretching the limits of what the brain perceives as dangerous, so that on actual race day, the brain's panic threshold is calibrated much, much higher.
You are literally callousing the mind. Okay, let's get into the heavy hitters. The core of this deep dive. We have a massive list of tools, techniques, and psychological traps drawn directly from elite coaches and sports psychologists. Let's group these together into actionable themes, exploring both how to build mental toughness and the insidious ways we accidentally destroy it.
Sounds good.
Let's start with theme 1, the narrative sandbox, which is all about internal language and motivation.
The internal narrative is the baseline. We all have an internal monologue. And during a grueling event, as ego depletion sets in, that monologue usually turns incredibly negative and toxic. The foundational tool here is positive self-talk and mantras, but specifically utilizing the second person rule.
This was fascinating to me. I've always thought self-talk was just hyping yourself up in the mirror. But the research shows a massive quirk in human psychology. Talking to yourself in the second person, using the pronoun you, is significantly more effective at reducing perceived exertion than using the first person I.
Yeah.
Why is that?
It comes down to psychological distancing. When you are 50 miles in, exhausted, and your willpower is depleted, saying, I am strong, I can do this, feels like a desperate lie to your brain.
Because your body is telling you the exact opposite.
Right, your brain knows you aren't feeling strong. But when you shift the pronoun and say, you are strong, you have trained for this, it simulates the neurological experience of receiving external coaching or support.
Oh, that makes sense.
It creates a slight dissociation. It feels like a trusted mentor is encouraging you, which bypasses the brain's internal skepticism, calms the amygdala, and tangibly lowers your heart rate and perceived effort.
And the sources gave an amazing, slightly weird example of a mantra from Courtney Dahlwalter, who is arguably the greatest ultra runner on the planet right now. When she is deep in the pain cave, her go-to mantra is just 3 words: robot, robot, robot.
It is brilliantly effective. By repeating robot, 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 she's completely mechanizing her movement. She's actively detaching her emotional human experience from the physical act of putting one foot in front of the other.
She becomes a machine.
A robot doesn't feel pain. A robot doesn't feel sorry for itself. A robot doesn't worry about the remaining distance. A robot just executes the programming. It's a perfect cognitive tool to shut down emotional panic.
But the dark mirror to this, one of the fastest ways to destroy your mental toughness, is engaging in first-person negative storytelling.
Yes, this is a fatal error. When you start vocalizing or even just internally repeating phrases like, I am failing, I am too slow, or I am completely exhausted, you are actively programming your brain for physiological failure.
The sources mention self-affirmation theory here. What is that?
Self-affirmation theory states that individuals have a fundamental need to maintain the integrity of their self-concept, and they will subconsciously act in accordance with what they believe to be true about themselves in that moment.
So if you say you're failing, you will fail.
If you repeatedly tell yourself you are failing, your body will literally adapt to make that narrative a reality. Your brain accepts the narrative, reduces neural drive to the muscles, your posture slumps, your breathing becomes shallow, and you will manifest the exact failure you are verbalizing.
Wow. And tied directly into that internal narrative is the concept of motivation. Where are you drawing your energy from? The sources highlight that losing touch with your intrinsic why, or relying heavily on external motivation, is a guaranteed way to hit a mental wall.
Motivation exists on a spectrum. External motivation is running 100 miles to post a cool photo on social media, to impress your coworkers, or to prove your ex wrong.
Right.
Intrinsic motivation is running because you want to explore the absolute limits of your own potential, or for deep spiritual or personal fulfillment.
And I imagine Instagram likes aren't going to save you when you're puking on your own shoes at 3 a.m.
They absolutely will not. External motivation is incredibly brittle. It leads to rapid ego depletion. When the physical suffering becomes acute, external rewards lose all their psychological value. The brain realizes that a social media post is not worth the current level of tissue damage, and it shuts you down.
You just bonk.
You must have a deep, intrinsic personal why, a core reason that matters only to you, to anchor your mind when the physical distress peaks. And this goes back to aligning goals with personal reasons to prevent burnout. If you have an amateur athlete trying to build self-belief without a professional coach, this is where they start. They don't need a coach to define their intrinsic why.
Which leads right into the ultimate identity trap, the most dangerous internal narrative of all, tying your personal identity entirely to the race outcome.
This brings us back to the dangers of obsessive passion. If you believe that your fundamental worth as a human being is dependent on crossing that finish line, a DNF doesn't just mean you had a bad athletic day. It means you are a failure as a person.
It is so heavy.
It puts a catastrophic amount of psychological pressure on the athlete. That pressure creates severe performance anxiety, which spikes cortisol and heart rate, wastes metabolic energy, and ironically makes a DNF much more likely.
The sources included a brilliant piece of advice on this from Danielle Snyder, who is both a licensed mental health professional and an ultra runner. She tells athletes who are spiraling over a DNF, your dog doesn't care if you DNF'd.
It is the perfect grounding reality check. The world keeps spinning. Your family still loves you. Your dog is still thrilled to see you.
Yeah.
Snyder's clinical advice is incredibly healthy. If you DNF, allow yourself to grieve. You put in months of work. It is entirely valid to be sad. But you must set a strict time limit on the mourning period, say 48 hours.
And
You analyze the data, figure out what went wrong nutritionally or physically, learn the lesson, and then move on before the failure integrates into your core narrative about who you are.
let's move to theme 2, expectation management. This covers visualization and goal setting. Now, if I am prepping for a huge race, my instinct is to use visualization to picture myself crossing the finish line, arms raised, feeling like a superhero. But the sources call this sunny day visualization and say it's actually highly destructive. Why?
Because it leaves your psyche incredibly vulnerable. If you spend 6 months only daydreaming about a perfect, effortless race, you are setting an expectation that reality cannot possibly match.
Because things will always go wrong.
The reality of an ultramarathon is messy, painful, and chaotic. When the inevitable wave of deep pain hits at mile 40, an athlete who only practiced sunny day visualization will go into psychological shock. Their brain perceives the pain as an anomaly, a terrifying sign that something is terribly wrong with the plan rather than an expected part of the journey.
So what is the alternative? The tool they suggest is adversity visualization or a negative rehearsal.
Yes. Adversity visualization is about intentionally daydreaming about the struggle.
I have to push back here. Sports psychology has been telling us for decades to visualize success. You're telling me I should sit on my couch and vividly picture myself throwing up in the bushes or getting a massive blister. Doesn't focusing on failure just become a self-fulfilling prophecy?
It's a fair question, but there is a crucial difference between visualizing failure and visualizing problem solving. You aren't visualizing quitting. You picture the nausea. You picture your headlamp dying in the pitch black. You picture a trekking pole snapping in half.
Okay.
But the mandatory second step of the exercise is that you then script and visualize your calm response. If my headlamp dies, I will calmly stop, reach into my left pocket, pull out the backup battery, and change it in the dark. If I feel nauseous, I will slow my pace to a walk, I will eat a ginger chew, and I will sip water.
So you are preloading the neurological pathways.
Exactly. You are building mental fire drills. So when the crisis actually happens in the race, you don't experience an amygdala hijack and panic. You simply execute the protocol you have already rehearsed 100 times in your mind.
That makes so much sense. It takes the emotion out of the crisis. And this concept of flexibility ties perfectly into goal setting. One of the major ways to hurt your mental toughness is setting rigid, inflexible goals.
If an athlete goes into a race with only one rigid metric for success, say running a sub 24-hour time, they are setting a psychological trap. The moment they get a flat tire on a bike or twist an ankle or experience severe stomach issues, that singular goal is dead.
And their motivation just vanishes.
Because they have no backup goal, their motivation instantly drops to zero.
It leads to what the sources call a soft DNF.
Right. A soft DNF is when an athlete quits not because they are structurally injured or pulled by medical staff for missing a time cutoff, but simply because their ego couldn't handle the fact that the A plan derailed. They quit entirely due to emotional despair.
To combat this, elite coaches use A, B, and C goal setting. And I have to bring up the story of Doug Stewart at the UTMB to illustrate this.
Oh, that is a legendary story.
The UTMB, the Ultra Trail du Mont Blanc, is this massive, legendary 107-mile race through the Alps with crazy elevation gain.
Yep.
Doug trained for 30 weeks. It's the biggest race of his life. He's 3 hours into the race, and the guy running directly in front of him gets his trekking pole stuck in a gap on a wooden bridge.
Right.
The guy aggressively yanks it out, the pole springs back, and it hits Doug squarely in the groin.
A truly catastrophic, incredibly painful, and highly specific piece of bad luck.
Unbelievable bad luck. He is doubled over in excruciating pain. The trauma triggers an intense vagal response and severe nausea hits. He literally cannot process a single calorie of food for the next 9 hours of climbing through the Alps.
Just awful.
But his dream finish time is completely obliterated right there at mile 3. Most people would have hobbled back to the start line and quit, but he didn't.
And he didn't quit because he utilized multi-tiered goal setting. An A goal is your perfect day, everything goes right. A B goal is a solid, realistic finish, maybe a bit slower. And a C goal is simply crossing the finish line, surviving the event no matter what happens.
Just finished.
When disaster struck, Doug didn't have to face the existential despair of complete failure. He simply shifted his focus. He allowed himself to briefly grieve the loss of the A goal, and then immediately pivoted his entire psychological framework to the C goal. Just survive and finish. Because he had predefined that C goal as a valid, honorable measure of success months before the race, his intrinsic motivation didn't evaporate.
That is the absolute power of psychological flexibility. Setting those secondary goals prevents burnout when the main plan changes. Let's shift to theme 3, managing scale, horizon, and competitors. How the brain perceives the sheer volume of the task ahead. One of the quickest ways to spike your perceived exertion is fixating on the total distance remaining.
The human brain simply cannot process the concept of running 100 miles. The scale is too massive. It causes psychological paralysis. If you are at mile 20 and you allow yourself to deeply contemplate the fact that you still have 80 miles to go, which is 3 back-to-back marathons, it will break you.
Yeah, that's just too much to hold in your head.
Staring at the massive totality of the distance overwhelms the psyche. It breeds a feeling of hopelessness. The brain calculates the sheer volume of impending suffering and responds by radically spiking your RPE. You physically feel heavier, slower, and more tired simply because you thought about how far you have left to go.
Just thinking about running 3 back-to-back marathons makes me want to lie down right now. So the counter tool for this is segmentation or chunking.
Exactly. You have to break the beast down into digestible pieces. You never set out to run 100 miles. You run to the next aid station. When things get really dark, you just run to the next tree or the next rock.
I've also heard of runners chunking the race into larger narrative themes.
Yes, that's a highly effective cognitive strategy. You break a 100-miler into 4 distinct marathon blocks. You give each chunk a unique identity. The first marathon is the warm-up. The second is settling in. The third is the dark night of the soul. The fourth is the final push.
I love that.
By giving each segment a unique identity and purpose, you provide the brain with short-term, achievable horizons. Every time you finish a chunk, your brain releases a hit of dopamine, the reward neurochemical, which provides a tangible physiological boost of energy for the next segment.
And part of managing that horizon is also managing who is in it. The sources brought up a fascinating psychological trap, which is focusing on competitors. And there is actual quantified physiological data on this called the 2% drop.
This goes back to brilliant laboratory research from Professor Tim Noakes. In controlled time trials, they had athletes race against each other. They hooked them up to monitors and found that the exact moment an athlete consciously perceives that they are losing, or when they are actively being passed by a competitor, their physical performance output drops by a measurable 2%.
Wait, their body physically slows down just because of the psychological blow of being passed, even if they aren't tired?
Yes. From an evolutionary standpoint, the brain is constantly evaluating energy expenditure versus status and reward. When you are passed, the brain subconsciously decides the massive effort is no longer worth the diminishing reward of winning, so it actively reduces neural output to conserve energy.
That is wild.
And conversely, the athlete who is doing the passing gets a 1.5% boost in performance. The ultimate takeaway from mental toughness is that focusing on other people gives away your psychological power. You cannot control the fitness, pacing, or genetics of the person next to you. You must run your own race, keeping your focus strictly internal to avoid that devastating 2% psychological penalty.
Run your own race. Control the controllables. Let's move to theme 4, the physical mental bridge. This is where chemistry, pacing, and data intersect. A classic physical mistake that destroys mental toughness is going out too fast, too early. But you're saying this isn't just a physical error, it's a mental toughness killer.
It is the ultimate mental toughness killer, and it ties directly back to the central governor model. Your brain has calculated an optimal, safe pace based on your training history and the visual distance ahead. If you get caught up in the race day adrenaline, or you're trying to keep up with faster competitors and you sprint the first 5 miles of a 50-mile race, you are severely deviating from the brain's safety parameters.
You are poking the bear.
You are violently triggering the central governor prematurely. The brain senses catastrophic danger. It runs the math and calculates that at this current unsustainable pace, you will experience organ failure before the finish line.
So it hits the brakes.
It intervenes aggressively. It dials down muscle activation and floods you with a profound systemic sense of fatigue that is almost impossible to mentally override for the remainder of the race.
So pacing is mental protection. On the flip side of that, how do we use data to protect ourselves?
Yeah.
The sources highly recommend using a structured running log. But this isn't just about casually tracking your miles on an app like Strava to show your friends.
Right. No, it is much deeper than social tracking. Keeping a detailed, private running log creates an enormous, personalized database of your past training. You track mileage, yes, but you also track how you felt, the weather, the fueling.
Why does this matter for mental toughness?
Because it builds self-efficacy, which psychologists define as the deep-seated, unshakable belief in your own ability to execute a specific task. When you are at mile 80 and the doubt creeps in and your inner critic says, you don't belong here, you haven't trained enough, you don't just try to blindly psych yourself up with empty hype, you review the data.
You mentally pull up the log and say, actually, I did 6 back-to-back long runs in the freezing rain. I put in 50,000 feet of vertical gain. I did the work.
Exactly. You trust specific empirical data, not vague hope. The log provides the hard evidence your logical brain needs to silence the emotional panic of the inner critic.
I love that. Data over doubt. It's a great way to track resilience improvements. Now, here is a tool that I was highly skeptical of. Practicing gratitude mid-race, specifically the 3 good things exercise. Now, I know gratitude is a huge wellness buzzword, but frankly, if I am chafing, my feet are bleeding, and I'm puking at 3 a.m, and you tell me to practice gratitude, I'm gonna be furious.
I completely understand the skepticism. It sounds like toxic positivity, but there's hard, undeniable neurochemistry behind this. When you are exhausted and miserable, your body is in a state of high alert. Your adrenal glands are flooding your system with cortisol, the primary stress hormone.
Right.
Cortisol breaks down muscle tissue and accelerates ego depletion. Practicing active gratitude, literally forcing yourself to list out loud 3 things you are thankful for, even if it's just the fact that your socks are dry or the sunrise is pretty or you have a functioning body that allows you to attempt this crazy thing, it triggers an immediate chemical shift.
It's a neurochemical counterattack.
Precisely. The act of feeling gratitude triggers the release of dopamine and serotonin. It chemically alters your brain state, counteracting the cortisol stress response. It physically relaxes the tension in your body, lowers your heart rate, and reconnects you with your intrinsic why. It reminds you that you chose to be out here, it is a privilege to struggle, and it rapidly reverses the feelings of burnout.
That is fascinating. It's not about being happy. It's about changing the chemical bath your brain is soaking in. Another crucial tool for managing these dark moments is the decide later or 20-minute reassessment rule. This feels like an absolute lifesaver.
It is the single most practical piece of advice for avoiding a regretful DNF. When an athlete stumbles into an aid station in the middle of the night, freezing, calorie depleted, and emotionally shattered, the urge to quit is overwhelming. The rule is simple. You are not allowed to hand over your tracker and quit immediately. You must commit to sitting down, putting on a warm jacket, eating some solid food, drinking a cup of hot broth, and waiting exactly 20 minutes.
If I'm applying this to daily life, if I'm writing a massive report and want to quit and delete it all at 11 p.m., I shouldn't just close the laptop. I step away, drink some water, and wait 20 minutes. What exactly happens in that window?
Two vital physiological things occur. First, the glucose and sodium from the food hit your bloodstream and cross the blood-brain barrier, literally providing fuel to the prefrontal cortex so it can think rationally again. Second, the brief period of rest resets the central governor.
Because it feels safe again.
The brain realizes the immediate acute danger of the trail has passed. Almost always, after 20 minutes, the emotional panic subsides, the physiological state improves slightly, the warmth returns to the extremities, and the overwhelming urge to quit passes. You realize you can go just a little further. Never quit in the dark, and never quit on an empty stomach.
Which brings us to our final theme, Theme 5. Somatic awareness, managing sensory input and pain. And this relies heavily on mindfulness and body and brain scans. Again, mindfulness sounds a bit zen for a grueling endurance event.
It connects back to the philosophical idea of separating the object from the subject. When you are in intense pain, it's very easy to let the pain define your entire reality. You fuse with the sensation. You think, I am in agony, I am failing. Mindfulness, in an athletic context, teaches you to become a neutral, detached observer of your own physical sensations.
How do you practically do a body scan while running down a mountain?
You systematically move your conscious attention through your physical form, like a radar sweep. You start at your feet. How do my toes feel? Okay, a little tight, maybe a hot spot forming. You move to the calves. My calves are burning. Move up to the shoulders. My shoulders are tense. I'm holding them too high. The key is that you acknowledge the sensation without attaching a negative emotion or panic to it.
You're just observing.
You are just collecting data. This prevents the pain-panic spiral. And crucially, this neutral observation helps you differentiate between normal, systemic race discomfort, which you accept and push through, and sharp, true injury pain, which requires immediate triage.
Just observing the data, not judging it. That requires a lot of presence, which ties into the technique for managing race day anxiety. Grounding via the 5 senses, specifically the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 technique.
This is a classic cognitive behavioral tool used to manage severe anxiety and panic attacks. When athletes get anxious, they're usually future tripping. Their mind is miles down the trail, worrying about upcoming climbs, cutoff times, or how much it's going to hurt later. This technique snaps the brain forcefully back to the present moment. You force yourself to identify 5 things you can currently see, 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, and 1 thing you can taste.
So I see the dirt on the trail, I see the pine trees, I see the reflective tape on the runner ahead, I touch my water flask, I touch the fabric of my shirt.
Exactly. It forces the brain's processing power to deal with immediate, tangible sensory data. This acts as a psychological anchor, pulling you out of the escalating spiral of future anxiety and grounding you right here, right now, in the exact step you are taking. It's a great tool for an amateur runner to incorporate into a daily mental training plan.
Finally, we have to talk about GI distress, because vomiting and nausea are the #1 reasons people drop out of ultramarathons. The tool here is acceptance therapy and reframing for stressors.
This is about embracing the messy reality of the event rather than fighting it. If you know it's going to be 100 degrees on race day, you don't spend energy complaining about the heat. You reframe the heat as your training partner. You adopt the mantra of effort over ego, accepting that your pace will naturally be much slower and focusing purely on your perceived effort level rather than your GPS watch.
And how does acceptance apply to nausea? Because fighting nausea seems like a natural human reflex.
It is a natural reflex, but it's the wrong one in this context. When runners start to feel nauseous, they panic. They physically tense up their abdominal wall, their breathing gets shallow, and they focus intensely on not vomiting. This anxiety actually amplifies the physical sensation of nausea.
It makes it worse.
Acceptance therapy means acknowledging the reality out loud. Okay, I feel sick, my gut is sloshing. This is a highly normal, expected part of the plan for a 100-mile race. By radically accepting the symptom rather than fighting it, you conserve the immense cognitive energy you would have wasted on panic.
That makes total sense.
You can then focus on practical solutions, like slowing down to a hike to let oxygen-rich blood return from your legs to your gut to aid digestion. Sometimes accepting that you just need to pull over, throw up, and reset is the smartest tactical move you can make.
So if we zoom out and look at this massive tapestry of information we've unpacked today, from the historical battlefields to the high Alps, from Dr. Noka's labs to Courtney Dahlwalter's robot mantras, what does this all mean? The overarching theme here is profoundly empowering. The mind is not just a passive passenger trapped in a failing physical vehicle. The mind is the ultimate active governor of your physical reality.
Without a doubt.
The fatigue we feel, the pain we experience, these are not always hard, immovable physical limits. They're often calculated signals, emotional responses, and protective software mechanisms designed by the brain to keep us comfortable and safe. But by understanding the science behind the central governor model and the psychobiological model, we realize those limits are highly negotiable.
They absolutely are.
By actively training our minds through daily practice of second-person self-talk, adversity visualization, chunking, gratitude, and somatic mindfulness, we can literally reprogram our biological response to suffering. We can push back our boundaries and access physical reserves we didn't even know we had.
It completely reframes what human beings are capable of. And the most important takeaway is that this isn't just about finishing an ultramarathon. The exact same psychological architecture and tools we've discussed are applicable to the very fabric of human endurance in all its forms.
Give me a final thought on that, something for the listener to take away and chew on after they finish this deep dive.
You don't ever have to run 100 miles through the woods to use these tools. I want you to think about the ultramarathons in your daily life. Maybe it's a grueling 6-month project at work with a terrible boss. Maybe it's a difficult, exhausting season of parenting a newborn or navigating a personal crisis where you feel completely depleted and want to quit. Where in your life is your own central governor shutting you down prematurely? Where are you confusing mental fatigue with physical inability? And what would happen if the next time you feel like throwing in the towel, you paused, did a 20-minute reassessment, changed your internal narrative to the second person, and chunked the massive problem down to just the next aid station? You might find that your engine isn't out of gas at all. You just needed to renegotiate with the driver.
It is the absolute definition of pushing the limits. Thank you for joining us on this custom-tailored deep dive into the science of mental toughness. We hope these tools help you find that extra gear, whatever your personal finish line might be. Keep questioning, keep pushing, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.
An ultra runner at like mile 70 of a 100-mile race.
Right, their Achilles is throbbing.
Exactly. Glycogen stores are just entirely depleted, and their brain is practically screaming at them to stop.
But physiologically speaking, they might actually have, 30% of their energy reserves left?
Yeah, exactly. Neurologically, though, they are redlining. The warning lights are flashing. So how do you coach an athlete to survive that exact moment? Do you arm them with rigid, rehearsed mental scripts to actively override the brain's panic?
Or do you teach them to organically surrender to the pain cave and, trust their intuition?
That is exactly the diagnostic muddy water we're stepping into today.
It really is. I mean, if an athlete breaks a bone, an X-ray gives us a clean, jagged white line. It's completely binary. But when you look at the complex psychology of endurance performance, specifically how the brain regulates fatigue, that X-ray machine is just utterly useless.
We are dealing with invisible forces, and navigating those invisible forces is our focus today. We're tailoring this specifically for our audience of sports science students and the professional endurance coaches who are in the trenches training amateur athletes.
Right. And the central question is mental resilience best cultivated through rigorous, structured mental training, or is it through intuitive, organic growth and exposure to adversity?
I'll be arguing that mental toughness is a highly trainable skill requiring structured, specific drills to actively override the brain's limits.
And I will defend the perspective that true resilience is an organic, intuitive capacity, developed holistically through exposure and self-awareness.
So, opening round. Let's start with the foundation of how we build this endurance mindset. My philosophy is pretty straightforward. The mind is a mechanism, much like the cardiovascular system.
Okay.
Just as your athletes follow strict physiological training plans, periodized cycles, specific interval paces, calculated recovery windows, their mental skills must be systematically drilled.
But you're treating the brain like a muscle to be measured.
Because it responds like one. There's this pervasive myth in endurance sports that mental toughness is a fixed genetic trait. Like you either have the grit or you don't.
Well, I don't think it's entirely fixed.
But the data simply doesn't support that it's innate. Research actually demonstrates that athletes who employ specific structured techniques like multisensory visualization achieve a 22% performance improvement.
Wow, 22%.
Yes, you cannot leave a 22% margin to chance. Think about it. We would never leave an athlete's cardiovascular fitness or their VO2 max to pure chance and intuition. We don't just tell them to run however they feel and hope their stroke volume increases.
Right, we program it.
Exactly. So why on earth would we leave their cognitive resources to chance?
I see your point, but I come at it from a completely different angle. I agree resilience is learned, not innate. But the method of that learning is where we really diverge.
How so?
You're treating the human brain like a machine that just needs the right line of code. But an athlete is an integrated living organism. True mental endurance isn't a rigid script you memorize in a sterile gym environment.
I wouldn't call it sterile, but okay.
Well, it's controlled, right? But organic adversity actually shapes our neurobiology. You develop true endurance by deciding to go for a long run when it's pouring rain, or running on deeply fatigued legs the day after a grueling interval workout.
Sure, organic exposure is part of training.
But it's the core of it. It requires developing a deep intuitive connection with your body's natural signals. You can't just spreadsheet your way out of the darkest moments of a race. You have to rely on a holistic adaptability that you've absorbed organically over time.
I have to push back there. Using the psychobiological model, this model is critical because it explains the actual mechanism of fatigue. It posits that performance is not limited by physical capacity.
Right, it's limited by the brain.
Exactly, by a very specific mathematical equation in the brain. It's the precise point where the rating of perceived exertion, or RPE, exceeds the athlete's motivation to continue.
And you think you can just artificially hack that equation?
Yes, because RPE isn't just a feeling, it's a neurological calculation weighing muscular feedback against dopaminergic reward. Our job as coaches is to manipulate that equation. We use structured suffer sessions as a tool to actively lower that RPE.
I'm sorry, I just don't buy that controlled suffer sessions are the optimal path.
They literally rewire the baseline for exertion.
But the value doesn't come from lowering a metric like RPE on a coaching chart. It comes from the organic realization that the athlete can survive the unpredictable. If you overstructure their mental prep, you actually build a fragile athlete.
Fragile? How is being prepared fragile?
They become like a train on a track, highly efficient as long as the conditions are perfect. But the second the race presents a variable that wasn't in the rehearsed mental script, say a sudden hailstorm or their stomach rejecting nutrition at mile 40, they just derail.
That's an interesting point. But structuring mental preparation doesn't create fragility. It creates a reliable cognitive baseline, which actually brings us perfectly to race day execution.
Let's hear it.
Look at Tim Noakes' central governor theory. It fundamentally changed how we understand race execution. Noakes proved the brain acts as an overprotective parent.
Monitoring homeostatic balance.
Right? When it senses a threat, like glycogen depletion or rising core temperature, it generates the emotion of fatigue to force the runner to slow down. It limits motor unit recruitment long before actual physiological failure occurs.
Okay, yes.
So, structuring a mental script is like installing a governor on a golf cart. You aren't changing the engine. You write explicit code to tell the engine to ignore the dashboard warning lights.
Wait, hold on. Before you go further into hacking the brain, I have to challenge this whole governor analogy.
Why? It's widely accepted.
It treats the brain's signals as a nuisance to be silenced. Have you considered the interoceptive model of fatigue?
I have, but I find it less actionable.
It's incredibly actionable. It focuses on the insular cortex, which maps visceral states. Interoception is about accurately interpreting bodily signals rather than fighting them.
But fighting them is often necessary when you're racing.
If you teach an athlete to view their brain as an enemy they have to override, you are setting them up for catastrophic failure. Mindfulness and body scanning don't ignore the warning lights. They uncouple the physical sensation from the emotional panic.
But neutral observation isn't enough when the central governor is actively shutting down your muscle recruitment. You need explicit segmentation and mantras.
Mantras, really?
Yes. First, segmentation. We chunk the race. If you think about running 100 miles, the brain's threat response is massive. So we explicitly train the athlete to only focus on the next aid station, immediacy over eventuality.
I can agree with chunking to some extent, but mantras?
Evidence shows that cyclists using second-person self-talk, saying, "You can do this," instead of "I can do this," race 2.2% faster.
Wait, why is that exactly? Why would a simple pronoun shift make someone faster?
Cognitive distancing. When you say "I," you are locked into the subjective emotional experience of the amygdala. You are the pain. When you say you shift the brain's perspective to an objective observer, engaging the prefrontal cortex.
That sounds almost like a parlor trick.
It's neuroscience. Elite runners use highly personalized reach-id scripts. For a grueling uphill section, a runner is trained to repeat, "I am an efficient and fast hiker." Or look at Courtney Dahlwalter's robot technique to mechanically override panic signals. They actively manage their cognitive load.
Okay, here is my specific pushback on that. If an athlete blindly repeats a rigid mantra like robot, robot, to override the central governor, how do they distinguish between efficiency discomfort, which is just the expected muscle burn, and primal pain?
What do you mean?
Primal pain is a tearing Achilles tendon or a stress fracture. Doesn't structured scripting mask dangerous career-ending injury signals? If your cognitive load is consumed by a script, you're deafening yourself.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning, honestly. Structured scripting and body awareness are not mutually exclusive.
But they are competing for attention.
No, when an athlete uses a mantra, they aren't deafening themselves to primal pain. They are silencing the false alarm of the central governor. Primal pain is sharp and localized.
Right.
Efficiency discomfort is a heavy systemic burn. The mantra keeps the athlete moving through the systemic burn. And by segmenting the race and using self-talk, they are actually reducing their cognitive load. The script makes the decision for them.
I come at it from a different way. Mindfulness requires zero script, which means it requires zero working memory.
But it requires immense mental discipline to just sit in that pain.
You observe the tightness in the calf, you label it as neutral information, and you peacefully coexist with it. Experienced ultrarunners develop a highly sensitive ability to read these signals organically.
I just think that's asking too much of an amateur runner at mile 40.
They don't need to trick their brains with second-person pronouns. They reestablish a baseline of pain acceptance. They understand what I call the moral language of suffering, that this pain is a teacher, not a threat.
Okay, let me stop you right there. I have to push back on the moral language of suffering.
It's a real concept.
It sounds incredibly poetic. But if I'm a coach with a weeping athlete sitting on a cooler at an aid station at 3 a.m., poetry doesn't get them back on the trail.
It's not just poetry, it's a framing mechanism.
But how does that translate to actionable recovery and progression? Post-race reflection must be just as structured as the preparation. We have to translate failure into data.
Data alone doesn't heal a DNF?
No, but it processes it. I teach coaches to have their athletes conduct structured recovery audits using the BASIC method in the running logs.
What does that actually entail in practice?
It's an acronym. They systematically track body, arousal, self-talk, imagery, and concentration.
Okay, so more spreadsheets.
After it did not finish, the athlete is drowning in emotion. By having them log their arousal on a scale of 1 to 10 at different mile markers, you pull them out of the emotional experience. You force their prefrontal cortex to engage in data analysis.
And that shifts blood flow away from the amygdala.
Literally, yes. By logging these metrics, they objectively review their failures, adjust pacing, and refine techniques. It turns an emotional burden into an actionable spreadsheet.
I can see that data processing is useful for shifting blood flow, but I think it misses the broader human application here.
Which is?
When we talk about processing race trauma and exploring that moral language of suffering, we're looking at something profound that extends way beyond the trail. Let's frame this for business leaders, right?
Sure, corporate endurance is a big topic.
As a coach, your athlete might be a CEO or a team leader. The principles of endurance recovery are directly parallel to everyday leadership. Just as a runner cannot sustain maximum effort without rebuilding muscle tissue, a corporate team cannot sustain productivity without scheduled recovery.
I agree with the parallel. But how does organic adaptability serve a CEO better than structured analysis?
Because in business, just like in a 100-mile race, the environment is inherently unpredictable. When an organic setback occurs, a failed product launch, a sudden market shift, it acts as a springboard for growth. If you teach an athlete to organically process failure rather than just tallying it in a basic audit, you give them neurological tools to recover from professional failures. I completely agree, endurance principles apply to corporate leadership. But even in business, recovery requires structure. A business leader tracking KPIs to manage a company's health is no different than an athlete tracking their mental imagery to manage physiological health.
KPIs aren't everything.
Structure creates the safety net that allows for bold performance. If a CEO just intuitively senses the market without looking at the data, they go bankrupt.
But structure can become a cage if it lacks flexibility. If your team only knows how to function when the conditions match their spreadsheet, they break the moment a storm rolls in. Intuition is about synthesizing millions of subtle data points that a spreadsheet simply can't capture.
That tension between structure and flexibility is exactly what everyday coaches struggle with. So let's bring these theoretical concepts down to earth. I want to pose a few hypothetical training dilemmas, like a rapid fire round. I'm game.
Dilemma 1, the panic block. You have an amateur runner who completely panics when faced with extreme distances. They're looking down the barrel of their first 50-miler, and the sheer volume paralyzes them. How do you help them organically?
I teach them to peacefully coexist with the discomfort of the unknown. I have them practice present moment anchoring.
During the panic?
Yes, when panic sets in during a long run, they focus entirely on their breath or the physical sensation of their foot hitting the dirt. The insular cortex is mapping that physical reality.
So they just ignore the 50 miles?
No, they acknowledge the emotional panic. They say, I am feeling overwhelmed by the distance, and then let it pass without judgment. It's about accepting the enormity of the task. How would your structured approach handle the panic block?
Through explicit segmentation drills. I would instruct the coach to strictly forbid the athlete from ever thinking about the 50 miles.
Forbid it entirely?
Yes. As I mentioned earlier, we chunk the race, but we train this actively. During a 20-mile training run, the goal is never 20 miles. The goal is 4 5-mile intervals.
That sounds exhausting to constantly manage.
It actually prevents exhausting. By breaking the distance into distinct segments, we prevent the central governor from triggering that massive threat response in the first place. The brain never processes the trauma of 50 miles. It only ever processes 5 miles 10 times.
Let's look at another scenario. What is the single best way a novice can practice these mental skills daily?
Daily exercises? Okay.
For me, it's about integrating organic discomfort into normal life. So the brain learns discomfort does not equal death. Taking a freezing cold shower every morning.
Cold showers. Classic.
It works. Or running without music so they sit in silence with their own thoughts. Practicing mindfulness on easy recovery runs so they learn to listen to subtle signals without the pressure of a stopwatch.
Those are fine lifestyle habits, but again, they lack specific athletic translation.
Enduring a cold shower translates to enduring discomfort.
Not necessarily the specific glycogen-depleted panic of an ultramarathon. I suggest a 10-minute multisensory visualization drill every single day.
Just sitting and visualizing?
Yes, but vividly. The smell of the dirt, the sound of the wind, the heavy quads. And crucially, not just success visualization. It's coping imagery. I want them to visualize a catastrophic failure.
Like what?
Losing their headlamp in the pitch black, severe stomach distress. And then they mentally rehearse exactly how they will calmly solve that specific problem.
How does visualizing a disaster prevent panic when it actually strikes?
It actively primes the neural pathways. When the brain imagines an action vividly, it fires the same motor and cognitive pathways as if it were actually doing it. So when the crisis occurs, the amygdala doesn't freak out.
Because it's familiar.
Exactly. It's a familiar, solvable problem rather than an unprecedented catastrophe.
That is a compelling argument for preparation. But have you considered that rehearsing specific failures might lock an athlete into expecting them?
I don't think it does.
The beauty of organic resilience is that you trust yourself to handle whatever happens, even if you never visualized it. You're building a general capacity for distress tolerance.
I think both approaches demand a profound level of respect for what the athlete is going through. If I am summarizing my position today, it remains anchored in the reality that the human brain is fundamentally designed to hold the body back.
That much is certainly true.
The central governor is a stubborn survival mechanism. To outsmart those psychobiological constraints, athletes require structured tools, mantras to manage cognitive load, explicit chunking, and rehearsed scripts. Without that structure, we leave athletes vulnerable to irrational fatigue.
And to summarize my defense, I maintain that organic body awareness is the safest, most holistic way to navigate those internal limits. Techniques like mindfulness and interoception teach an athlete to coexist with discomfort. It builds a lifelong resilience that transcends any rigid script, serving them on the trail and in the boardroom.
Yet despite our different approaches, we both acknowledge a profound point of convergence today.
Absolutely. The brain limits the body long before physiological failure actually occurs.
The evidence is staggering. Surveys show that 74.1% of ultrarunners are willing to push past known severe health risks just to finish a race.
That statistic is both terrifying and beautiful.
It proves the sheer power of the mind.
The human mind in endurance sports is incredibly complex. There is so much more nuance to explore within these models of fatigue. From the insular cortex to the psychobiological math of perceived exertion.
Ultimately, it is up to the sports science students and coaches listening today to determine how best to implement these tools. We started this conversation talking about medical diagnoses and how comforting a clear binary X-ray can be.
But the landscape of endurance psychology offers no such clean lines.
Exactly. It requires us to navigate the murky waters of fatigue, perception, and human will. As you coach your athletes through their own pain caves, remember that the true challenge isn't just fixing what's physically broken.
It's understanding the invisible forces that keep them moving forward.
Thank you for joining us on The Debate.
Viewing a submitted draft exploring how ultra running builds mental toughness, the top training methods to achieve it, and how these skills translate into professional resilience. The manuscript's explanation of physical limitations could be significantly deepened by more sharply contrasting standard physical conditioning with the psychological limits imposed by the brain.
Oh, okay. Jumping right in.
Yep, right into it. And the material makes a strong case for physical conditioning by highlighting, traditional metrics like VO2 max and lactic acid thresholds, which is great.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very thorough overview of like the muscular and cardiovascular prep. But is there a risk that focusing solely on the physical limits might overlook the brain's role as a central governor?
Yes, exactly. That's the core weakness here. The draft currently treats physical exhaustion and mental fatigue as these parallel, totally independent processes.
Right, like the body gets tired over here and the mind gets tired over there.
Right, which completely misses the actual biological nuance. The brain is it's preemptively regulating your physical output to preserve homeostasis.
Oh, so it's not just running out of gas.
No, not at all. And by failing to draw a hard contrast between traditional physical conditioning and psychological strategy, the material it misses the opportunity to explain why mental toughness training is even biologically necessary.
Okay, so what's the suggestion here? How does the writer fix that?
They need to reorganize these opening sections. Explicitly pit those traditional physical models against Dr. Tim Noakes' central governor theory.
Or the psychobiological model.
Right, the central governor theory. That's crucial.
Yeah, you have to show the reader that fatigue isn't a physiological absolute. It's an emotion or a perception generated by the brain acting like an overprotective parent, basically.
An overprotective parent, I like that analogy.
Yeah. It tricks the body into stopping way before true physical limits are reached because it wants to keep a massive reserve of energy safe just in case there's a survival threat.
But how do we make that concrete for the reader? Because neurological inhibition it's kind of dry, right?
Totally. So use the finish line sprint phenomenon as a concrete example.
Oh, yeah. Everyone knows that feeling. Exactly. Detail how a runner who is completely, just utterly physically exhausted at mile 16 can miraculously sprint the last 400 meters of a race.
Right, because if they were actually out of ATP, out of energy, that sprint would literally be impossible.
Precisely. The brain sees the finish line, realizes the threat to survival has passed, and just lets go of the reins. Another concrete example they should include is contrasting a 4-hour marathoner's actual physical limits with their ability to stretch their central governor.
Stretch the governor? Like through mental training?
Yeah, demonstrate that even if the governor were turned off, physical fitness remains a baseline constraint. You can't run faster than your cardiovascular system allows.
Sure, you can't just magically become an elite athlete just by thinking hard.
Right. But psychological strategy unlocks the reserve. So, moving on, let's look closely at the section discussing the top 5 training ways to improve mental toughness.
Okay, yeah.
The presentation of the top 5 mental training strategies lacks a clear structural progression from beginner applications to elite psychological models.
That's clearly laid out. I wonder, though, if we've considered how an elite runner's mental strategy compares against standard psychological models for beginners?
Well, that's the weakness in the current draft. It effectively lists the top 5 training ways: visualization, simulating discomfort, chunking, positive self-talk, and mindfulness. But it presents them as this flat, unweighted list.
Ah, I see. It's just bullet points.
Yeah, it completely fails to differentiate how a beginner should approach simple mental exercises versus how elite athletes employ, like, extreme strategies.
Which leaves the reader without a clear roadmap, right? Like, where do I start?
Exactly. So the suggestion is to restructure this section into a tiered, comparative approach.
Okay, tiered approach. How would that look in practice?
First, explicitly list 3 simple, actionable mental exercises for beginners to manage race discomfort during training runs. Then directly compare these foundational techniques against the advanced, high-stakes mental strategies used by elite runners.
That makes sense. It shows the evolution of the psychological conditioning. So, what are some concrete examples for that beginner tier?
Let's start with chunking. Outline breaking the race down from aid station to aid station, but explain the mechanism. It prevents the brain's amygdala from triggering a massive threat response.
Right, because thinking I have 50 miles left triggers panic, but I have 3 miles to the next tree is safe.
Exactly. The second beginner exercise should be second-person self-talk.
Second person, like saying you instead of I?
Yep. Using "you can do this" instead of "I can do this." Research actually shows that simple linguistic shift improves performance by 2.2%.
Wow, 2.2% just from changing a pronoun?
Yeah, because it creates psychological distance. And then the third beginner example could be body scanning or mindfulness, learning to calmly distinguish between normal efficiency discomfort, like burning lungs, and dangerous primal injury pain.
Right, so you're not just ignoring the pain, you're classifying it.
Yes. Now, contrast those beginner steps with elite strategies to really make it pop. For example, cite Courtney Dahlwalter's advanced chisel visualization.
Wait, the chisel visualization? What is that?
Oh, it's wild. When she's deep in the pain cave, instead of just visualizing a happy finish line, she actively visualizes herself grabbing a chisel and carving out more mental space in the cave.
Oh, wow, that is intense.
Right? It's active transformation of pain. Another elite example could be Kilian Jornet's trial and fail simulation runs.
What does he do?
He intentionally trains without sleep or water, within safe parameters, obviously, to intentionally map his absolute psychological limits.
He's literally trying to force the central governor to kick in just to see where the line is.
Exactly. So by structuring it this way, comparing beginner chunking to elite trial and fail, the reader gets a clear roadmap for athletic growth.
That's a huge improvement. Okay, what's the next area?
As I understand it from the notes, the argument here is that these mental habits translate into professional resilience.
Building on that point, what if we looked at it from the perspective of providing professional advice for athletes seeking to build daily psychological conditioning habits in the office?
That's exactly where the draft falls short. The conclusion's discussion of professional resilience misses an opportunity to draw direct, actionable parallels between specific running habits and daily psychological conditioning for business leaders.
So it's just too broad right now.
Yeah, it's a weakness. It successfully summarizes the general idea that runners make resilient professionals, but it relies on broad generalizations like running is hard, business is hard.
Right, which isn't really helpful if you're actually in a crisis at work.
No, not at all. It lacks actionable steps for corporate athletes who want to build daily psychological conditioning habits. It fails to explain how you actually coach yourself through the mental lows of the business world using ultra running techniques.
So the suggestion is to explicitly map that ultramarathon mindset directly to daily professional and personal practices?
Yes. Show the reader how the exact same techniques used to coach oneself through a mental low in a 100-mile race can be utilized to manage corporate crises, team building, and daily executive stress.
I love that. What are some concrete examples of how to map those over?
First, introduce the BASIC daily audit. It's an acronym. Body, arousal, self-talk, imagery, concentration.
Okay, BASIC. And they can use this at their desk?
Exactly. Just as runners use it on the trail. For example, if a project is crashing, an executive's amygdala fires up, right? The same physiological threat response as running down a dangerous mountain.
Right, heart racing, shallow breathing?
So they can manage the arousal part of the audit with deep diaphragmatic breathing at their desk to stimulate the vagus nerve, which literally tells the brain the environment is safe.
Oh, that's great. It's a biological hack for office stress.
Yep. Another concrete example, explain how the running concept of chunking directly mirrors project management.
Oh, breaking down a massive corporate project into micro wins?
You got it. Breaking it down into actionable micro wins prevents the executive's brain from triggering a threat response over a massive workload. It builds daily discipline.
Yeah, you just focus on the next spreadsheet, not the end of your deficit.
Exactly. And finally, highlight how surviving the pain cave and experiencing shared struggle in ultramarathons translates to adaptive problem solving in business.
Right, because things always go wrong in a race and things always go wrong in business.
Exactly. It teaches leaders to reframe corporate failures, like a lost client, as a necessary validation of the process rather than a final defeat.
That totally changes the perspective. It's not a failure, it's just a drop nutrition plan at mile 80. You just adapt.
Exactly. So let's recap this whole critique.
Sounds good.
All right, thank you for listening to this episode. I think mental toughness is definitely overcoming adversity, and with any training block, you can run into life, and you just have to adapt sometimes with training, whether that's changing your long runs or doing it on a different day and adjusting, or if it starts to snow outside or it starts to rain, and going anyways, that helps with the mental toughness as well. Doing things that at first you don't want to do, but doing them anyways because you have a goal to complete. Appreciate you listening to this episode. I do plan on dropping each episode at on Saturdays at 3 a.m. Just trying to get my mind in a mindset of an ultra runner, thinking that you guys would probably go on a long run Saturday mornings. If you wake up at 3, then that means maybe you get ready by 4 o'clock to get out the door, or 3:30. But whatever the case, hopefully you could download it before you leave. That way, if you're not using Wi-Fi or internet, you already have it downloaded on your device. So, but I'll try to do that. Just drop each episode on Friday morning at 3 a.m. Anyways, I appreciate you listening, and hopefully it gave you some value, and hopefully you can use it in your training. Definitely, I like the idea of breaking it into 4 different marathons. if you're running the 100. But you could still, break it up, even if you're doing, 100K or a 50 miler or a 31 miler or 32 miler. Just breaking it up and having goals, and that way you can be excited for your goals, whether that's reaching every 10 miles, you can celebrate or whatnot. But yeah, thanks for tuning in, and you can always reach out to me if there's something that I haven't talked about that you would like to hear, and we can discuss. And then also, if you would like coaching from me, you can always reach out through my email. That runningmileschd@gmail.com. All right, thank you so much.